Alright my friends, welcome to video lesson number 8. In this lesson I'm going to be discussing color correction and the use of the Lumetri color panel, the Lumetri scopes, masking, and our good friend the adjustment layer. Alright, so let's get started. I've got 3 different scenarios here where we're going to use color correction to improve the clips that we've got in the timeline. First I've got this interview scene here where we're going to go from this to this. Then I've got this ocean shoreline scene here where we're going to go from this to this. And then finally, this desert dune scene where we'll go from this to this. Alright, so let's get started with the interview. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is switch from my standard editing workspace to the color workspace. There's a couple different ways to do that. You can either go to Window, Workspaces, and then down to Color, or you can use this choice along the top bar here to switch over to that workspace. And you can see when I do, I get some new panels that are not contained in the editing workspace. One, I've got the Lumetri color panel here, and then I've also got my Lumetri scopes. And we're going to be using these two in conjunction to perform our color correction tasks on this interview clip. Now on the scopes panel here, I'm going to use the little wrench at the bottom to switch over from the RGB Parade waveform monitor here to the Luma waveform monitor. Clicking on that, it pops up the Luma waveform monitor, and I'm going to get rid of the RGB Parade one now. This is the waveform monitor I'm primarily concerned with for this lesson. It shows overall Luma value, and that is brightness of the overall combined signal, as opposed to any one channel, like the RGB Parade does, showing red, green, or blue. And then the other scope I want to use, side by side with my waveform Luma scope, is the vector scope YUV. This scope actually shows the strength of the color in my image and how it's distributed between red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. And you can see in this image that there's a lot of information in this red magenta quadrant here, and mostly it's tending toward the red end of things. And looking at the image visually, you can see there's kind of a red cast to the whole thing, especially on our interview subject's face. There's a bit of a red cast to his skin, which isn't quite natural. So one of the first things that we're going to do is try and return natural skin tone to our interview subject here. So before we do that, what I'm going to do is duplicate my video layer. I'm going to hold down Option, click on my video layer, drag it up, let go, then let go of Option, and you can see I've created an exact copy of that layer. And the reason I did this is because I want to be able to shut off video layer number 2 after I've made some changes and refer back to my original untouched video layer number 1. It's really helpful to be able to switch back and forth to check the progress of our color correction work. So as I mentioned, the first goal is to return our interview subject's skin tone to its natural state. So in order to do that, we're going to use the vector scope here to make sure that his skin tone is actually the natural color that it should be. So to get a reading on just his skin itself, we're going to need to isolate a piece of his skin to get a proper reading on this scope. Now to do that, what we're going to do is use a mask. We're going to mask off just a piece of our interview subject's cheek so we can get an isolated reading on only the skin and not everything else in the image. So I'm going to select the top layer of video here. I'm going to go over to the effect controls and I'm going to use an opacity mask. So if I go down to the opacity section of the effect controls, you can see I have a pen tool here, and I'm going to use that tool to draw a mask and isolate just a portion of our interview subject's face. Now I'm going to turn off the bottom layer here and grab my pen tool, and you can see as soon as I click on it, a mask is created, mask number 1. Now if I click on the pen tool again, I'll create another mask. This causes a lot of people problems. So just remember, every time you click on that pen, you're going to create a new mask. So I'm going to select that second mask and delete it. And I'm going to work only with the first mask here and that pen tool. And I'm going to zoom in a bit on our subject here so that I can get a better look at the area that I want to draw a mask on. So I'm just going to click and draw some points here, joining them together, connecting the dots until I isolate just a piece of his cheek. There we go. We've got just the skin tone in here now. Nothing else in the image at all. Go back to fit here. You can see that's the only thing that Premiere is showing us. So I'll go back to the Lumetri scopes, and you can see the vector scope is showing us that that skin tone is tending towards the red. All right, what we want to do is alter the color balance so that the skin tone is actually adjusted so that it falls on this line right here. This is the skin tone line. So we want to take the color of that skin and dial it over towards this line. So in order to do that, we're going to use the Lumetri color panel here to make that adjustment. So I'm going to use a combination of temperature and tint to do that. This is under the basic correction area of the Lumetri color panel. So right now it's tending red. So under the tint area here, I'm going to pull that slider away from the red, magenta area, more towards the green. And you can see as I do that, the scope reflects the change, and you can see that skin tone tending toward that skin tone line right over here. And that's what I want. Now we don't want to go too far because then you can see the skin actually ends up turning green, and we don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to get it just here on the line, and then I'm going to add a little bit of light brown into this to kind of give a little bit more natural appearance to the skin. Okay, light brown, a little bit of orange in there. All right, so now if I go back to my effect controls, and turn off my opacity mask, you can see we've adjusted the image. Now I can turn off my layer, my top layer here, turn back on the bottom one, turn off the top one, and you can see the overall color balance of the image has changed from that red cast to something that is more natural. Okay? The other thing I can do is turn off my Lumetri color effect just by hitting the effects button. Okay? Either way. So the next thing I want to do is make other adjustments to this image that improve it in different ways. So you can see on our subject's shirt here, we've got some overexposure going where there's actually a loss of information. I'd like to try and return some of the detail to this area here and make it not look so blown out. I'd also like to lighten up some of the really dark areas here on the folds of the jacket. And I'd like to give some overall color enhancement using saturation to increase the amount of color that is in the image to make it look a little more appealing. So for now, I'm going to shut off the vector scope and concentrate on the waveform monitor. Now it's interesting, you can actually read this monitor and make sense of what it's showing you. So this area here that's really tall is actually the brightest, whitest part of the image. That's his shirt and the lighter areas of his face and his hair. That's what's represented in this zone here. Now across the middle, you actually see a representation of these panels in the back. And you can see these dips between the panels here are the dark lines in the divisions of the panels themselves. And then this area here that's really low is actually the jacket that he's wearing, and in particular, these darker areas where the folds by his elbows are. So we have a couple of problems going on in this image. The blacks are actually a little too low. They're all the way down at 0 here. We'd like them to be a little bit higher, around 7.58. And then the whites are crushed up against 100 here. And that's why we have a loss of some of the information in this area and the detail not being properly represented. So what we want to do is bring down the whites and bring up the blacks just a little bit, which should help to return some of the detail into this area. So in order to do that, we're again going to use the Lumetri color panel here. And I'm going to look at the whites slider here and pull that down. And as I do, you can see that those whites that were crushed up against 100 get pulled down, and some of the detail actually returns to the shirt. You can see as I push it forward and crush those whites higher, the shirt loses more and more detail. As I pull it down to the left and those whites drop, the detail returns to the shirt. Now, the black areas here, you can see they're down around 0 here, actually touching 0. I'm going to use the black slider to adjust those. And what I'm trying to do is get them up around 7.5 or 8, just below 10 on the left side of the Waveform Luma scale here. So I'm going to use the black slider to bring them up so they're just below 10. That looks pretty good. Now I need to be careful with this slider, because as you can see, as I push it further to the right, the image quickly becomes washed out. Look at that. Not good. So I'm going to make sure they're dialed in just below 10 there. That looks good. Just around 8.2 or so. Looks good on the scope here. And the reason I'm doing these things with the black and white levels is because we want to be broadcast safe. If we were to deliver this video to a broadcast television station, one of the things they would do is analyze its safety for broadcast on a set of analytical scopes, one of which being the Waveform Luma monitor. And if our video had super crushed whites, smashed up against 100 or even over, or blacks that were down at 0 or even below 0, they might return it to us and say, we need you to fix this in order for us to broadcast it. So that's why it's important to use the scopes to make sure that the video that we're delivering is what's called broadcast safe. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is increase the contrast in our image here. So I'm going to use the contrast slider to do that. And if you pay attention to the scope over here, as I move the slider to the right, you can see what actually happens is the Luma values in the center move toward the top and the bottom. So this actually increases the difference between the bright parts of the image and the dark parts of the image, thereby adding more detail to the image. So you can see the very top part and the bottom part don't really change much. It's mostly just what's in the center moving upward and downward. So I'm going to go with about, I think, 25 here or so. Looks pretty good. And it did adjust the black level just slightly here, so I'm going to bring that up just a hair to make sure that it is at that 7.58 level. Looks good. Excellent. So now we've added a little more texture to our overall image here using contrast. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is add overall color to the image. General saturation using the saturation slider here. So I'm going to pull up my vector scope so that I can monitor what I'm doing color-wise to the image. And as I move the slider to the right, you can see that the vector scope reflects the amount of color that I'm adding. You can see the readout grows in strength. So I want to be careful with this because I don't want to cross this line right here. This is the color safety line. And if I cross this, I would be what is known as out of gamut, G-A-M-U-T. This is the gamut line. So I want to stay on the inside of this line in order to be color safe for broadcast. So I'm going to go with about 110, I think. I think that looks pretty good. So you can see the image now has a bit more color overall added to it. Very nice. All right, so the last thing I want to do to the image here is add what's called a vignette. Now this isn't really color correction. This is actually approaching the line between color correction and color grading. Color correction is actually just making the image look appropriate, making sure that values are where they should be for proper representation on screen. Color grading is more giving the image a specific look in order to create a certain understanding with the audience, an emotional response, or to cause the audience to focus on a specific area of the screen. So with the vignette, I'm going to start with a mount here, and I'm going to move it to the left. And you can see as I do, the corners of the image become a little bit darker. And what this does is create a little bit of additional depth to the image and cause the audience to focus their attention more into the center of the screen where our interview subject is. And it just plain looks cool. So there are a number of controls here. We've got a mount, and then we've got midpoint, roundness, and feather. Now you can see if I remove the feather, what we're actually working with here is an overlay that is a dark shape placed over the image at the corners. Now if I change the midpoint control here, you can see that I'm changing the size of that shape that comes out from the edges of the image here. All right, I usually stick with having just the corners covered. Roundness changes the shape of that overlay. And then feather changes the softness of the edge of that overlay. Usually want quite a bit of feather in there so that you have just the corners kind of pulled in like this. Okay, that looks kind of cool. I'm gonna go with that. It has sort of a cinematic look to it. All right, so let's turn off our top layer and see what we've done here. We've gone from this, where we've got an overall red cast, non-realistic skin tone, overexposure on the shirt, loss of detail in the darker areas here, to this, where we've got natural skin tone, detail return to the shirt and to the darker areas near the elbows, overall enhancement of all the color in the image with added saturation, and then the addition of a vignette to create a sort of cinematic look and direct the viewer's attention toward the center of the screen where our interview subject is sitting. Pretty cool. All right, so the next thing we're gonna do is give some love to this shoreline scene here. So we're gonna start out by again duplicating our original video layer, holding down Option, clicking, dragging up, letting go with the mouse, and then letting go with Option to create an exact duplicate of that video layer. Now with that layer selected, I'm gonna head up here and kind of inspect things. So starting out with the waveform Luma scope, you can see we've got a bit of an issue in the blacks area here. They're awfully close to 0. We want to bring these up to around 7.5, just under 10 here. And then looking at the vector scope, you can see what is clearly reflected in just visually inspecting the image here. There's very little color. Look how small this readout is. And there's really very little color in the general image here. So we want to add overall color, and then we want to make the sand look a little more natural, a little more brown, and then give some more richness to the blues in the water and the sky here. All right, so we're going to head over to basic correction to begin with. Okay, and we're going to work on the black levels here. So I'm going to take the black slider, move it over to the right, and you can see immediately I'm raising them up. I'm going to get them to about 7.5 here. All right, and those blacks are mainly the darker areas of the rocks here. You can see physically they're located in the same areas in frame and on the scope. Now I also want to work on the shadows here, things that aren't quite black. So I'm going to bring that slider over to the right a little bit too, and you can see some of the detail returns to those rocks, brings out a little bit more of the texture in those rocks. Great, that's nice. Okay, now I'm going to add some contrast here. Move that slider over to the right, maybe around 20, 25 or so. Okay. And my blacks got pushed down a little bit, so I'm going to raise those just a little bit more. There we go. That looks pretty good. All right, now I'm going to add some general saturation here. Color on all 3 channels. You can see when I do that, the vector scope reflects it. And I'm going to head over to about, I don't know, 130, 135 or so. Let's go with 130. All right, now that we've done that, I want to head down to curves. And if you're used to 2017, 2018, you're used to a little different view here than is reflected in this new panel in 2019. So we used to have a color isolation wheel. Now we've got separate panels for doing that sort of thing. And we're going to stick with the hue versus saturation panel on the hue saturation curves area here. So I'm going to close RGB. And what I want to do is take my eyedropper here and sample a bit of the blue up here to give me a range to work with. So I take the eyedropper, select some of the blue in the image here, and you can see some points are automatically put along this hue versus saturation line here. So the center point I'm going to grab and lift it up, and you can see when I do that, look at the vector scope, it's actually adding blue here to the image. If I pull it down, I'm draining blue out of the image. You can see that area of the ocean up there gets almost black and white. All right, so I'm going to pull this up, get some nice rich blue in there. Maybe I'll stretch this point out just a little bit so I affect a larger portion of the blue. Yeah, that's looking good. Okay, now moving the playhead forward into the image, after this wave comes in and washes back out, you can see the sand is super saturated here. It's really brown. I think it's a little too far. So what I'm going to do is sample some of that here, get some points, and pull just a little bit of only the brown out of the sand. There we go. That brings it a little more under control there. The original part still looks pretty good. Maybe I'll add just a hair back. There we go. All right, check both areas. That's pretty good. I'm liking it. Okay, now finally, let's head down to the vignette area here, and again, bring in the corners just slightly with a little bit of vignette. Feather that out a little more. Maybe that, yeah, that looks really good. Okay, so now let's check the progress of what we've done here by turning off the top layer and returning to what we originally started with. We went from this to this. Much better. Kind of washed out and lifeless here. Transformed into a much more color-rich image that is also much more pleasing to the eye. Again, pretty cool. All right, now moving on to our desert dune scene here. We're again going to duplicate our original video layer here, holding down Option, clicking, dragging up, letting go with the mouse, and then with Option, creating that exact copy. So let's do a little inspection here. Starting out with the scopes, the waveform LumaScope looks like we have black levels that are just a little bit too low. Probably these two riders here, maybe this area on this rider. We'll bring those up slightly. And then you can see we've got a spike that goes all the way out on the red vector here. And that is probably this person's shirt right here. So That's something to be conscious of because looking at this sky, it's rather drab. The sand could probably use a little more life as well. So if we add overall color, saturation to this image, it's gonna push this shirt way far over this gamut line. So we're gonna have to do a little bit of color isolation to pull back the red on the shirt, which will allow us to saturate the rest of the image more effectively and safely. All right, so again, we're gonna start with basic correction here. And we're gonna raise the black levels just slightly. Get those up to about 7.5, just below 10 here. Then we're gonna adjust the overall exposure here because as you can see, the brightest thing in the image is only around 70. We wanna bring that up a little bit higher, get a little more life into this image. You can see the sky gets even more faded, more towards the white end of the spectrum, but that's okay. We'll fix that in a little bit here. All right, so let's move down to the saturation slider here. Bring a little more color in general into the image and watch the vector scope. You can see that red shirt just moving more and more across that gamut line. Let's go with about 125 on that. But the sand looks a lot better now, doesn't it? Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's move down to curves again and fix the problem we have with this red shirt here. Grab my color picker, take a sample of the shirt, get my points, and see if I can pull out some of the red. Watching the vector scope, look at that, we're back inside the gamut line there. Nice. So if I push this forward, you can see the shirt gets much redder. Yeah. Let's bring it down nicely within safety zone here. That looks great. Okay. Now, we're going to do something a little bit special here. We want to bring some blue into this sky, and what we're going to do is isolate just the sky here and affect only it. So in order to do that, just like we did with our interview subject's cheek, we're going to use an opacity mask. So this is going to require me to make yet another layer of video because I want to preserve what I've done down here on the sand area, all right? And then I'm going to have a separate layer that is going to be just the sky. So I'm going to create another layer of video to do that. Again, using my option click trick. There we go. Now I'm going to head over to my effect controls here and draw an opacity mask on just my sky. Let's reduce the size here and draw my mask. This isn't going to be perfect, but it will be close. We can make adjustments later to kind of refine the shape of this mask. There we go. Now if I turn off the bottom layers, you can see I've got just the sky here. All right, now I'm going to zoom back in. Check the points along my mask here. Maybe zoom in a little bit more here. Make sure my points are refined. Now, if I need to add another point, I just click along the line here, adds another one. I'd like another one here too. Move this one down a little bit. Gonna get those lined up a little bit better. Yeah, that's pretty nice. Okay, so now that we've got this area isolated here, let's head over to the RGB curves area here and isolate just the blue channel. And what I'm going to do is bring more color to just the blue channel of the video signal. So I'm going to click a point up near the top here and a point near the bottom. And we're going to make what's called a classic S curve. So the top end represents the lighter areas of the blue, and the bottom end represents the deeper areas of the blue. So I'm going to move this point up, and then this point down just slightly. All right. Turn that off and on. You can see we've added more blue to that sky for sure. Let's look over at the scopes here and see what they're telling us. Let's isolate just the sky here. Turn it off and on, and you can see we've added some blue, definitely. All right, so now let's take that a little further and head up to basic correction. Add some more saturation to that. You can see that's helping a bit. And now let's head down to curves once again and reset what we did for the Red Rider's shirt. So to remove points here, I'm going to hold down Command and click, and that will remove those points. Let's take a sample of the sky. There we go. And let's add some more blue to that. You can see again, the vector scope is reacting to what we're doing. Let's see if we can increase the spectrum on that a little bit. There we go. Now let's turn this off and on. Oh, that's a huge difference. That's great. Okay, so let's turn back on our bottom layer. And you can see the sky goes from pretty plain here to much more rich on the blue end of the spectrum. So we've isolated that area with the mask here. Head over to the effect controls, click off of the mask. And you can see that's pretty cool. All right, head back to fit here. And again, the final thing I want to do is put a vignette on this image. Now, because I have layers that have isolated different portions of the screen, I've got just the sky up here, and then I've got the overall image here. If I put a vignette on either one of these layers, the other one will not have it. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to call upon our good friend the adjustment layer to help us out here. So what we're going to do is put a new layer above everything here called an adjustment layer. So if I head down to my project panel here and to the new item icon here, press on that button and choose adjustment layer, click OK on this dialog box to match my sequence settings. Drag that adjustment layer to make a new top layer of video here. Pull it to the overall length of my timeline. Now what I'm able to do is to apply an effect to make a change that affects everything below it. This isolated portion of the sky, in addition to the rest of the image in the lower portion of the screen. So now if I select my adjustment layer, head over to the vignette control, and make an adjustment to pull in these corners once again. Feather this out a little more. Yeah, that looks nice. Cool. All right, so if I turn off the adjustment layer, you can see that does the same thing as turning off the vignette effect, because that's all it has on it, just the vignette effect. That's the only purpose it's serving at this point. I could make other adjustments using this layer, but keeping in mind they affect everything below them. Very useful tool though, the adjustment layer. You can use it for many things. For instance, I could apply a couple cross dissolves to the ends here, hit home, and fade in on the entire image. In addition to fading out on the entire image. Because again, they affect everything below them. All three of these layers are affected by this adjustment layer. Okay. So for this clip, we were able to isolate the sky with an opacity mask, as you can see here, and add some blue some richness to that sky alone without affecting the sandy area here in the lower part of the image, because it's on a separate layer that is not at all affected by our isolated sky. We also added general saturation to the lower portion of the image and then controlled the red vector coming from this rider's shirt here by using a little bit of color isolation using the hue versus saturation curves control here, controlling just that red, bringing it back inside the safety gamut line here on our vector scope. And then with the waveform Luma scope, we brought our blacks up to that 7.5 range, and then also saw the need to increase the exposure just slightly for a little more overall brightness to our image. And then finally, using the adjustment layer, we brought in a vignette on the overall image, and then also added a fade in and fade out using cross dissolves. So this wouldn't be any fun if we couldn't see where we started. So let's turn on the original video layer here, turn off everything else, and see what we started with. Fairly drab. We've got a shirt that's just on the line of being oversaturated. You can see it actually crosses over a little bit there. And then because of the work that we did, we brought this into a very nice place, visually pleasing and also color safe. All right then, my friends, that does it for video lesson number 8. I'll see you again for video lesson number 9.